Samantha, it's good to see you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, you'll recall we last had a conversation in 2023 about disaster preparedness, emergency management, the kind of things that are in your background. Can you give our audience just a little bit more about your interests and what you do and how you've become, to some degree, an authority on this topic?
Yeah, so my primary job, I would say, is a disaster researcher. So I study all parts of the US disaster management system, including mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. I teach in an undergrad emergency management program, and I also do a lot of advocacy work about how we can make our disaster management system more effective, efficient, and equitable.
Mhm. And you and I have a shared love of New Orleans. I think you said in our last interview, if you can do disaster management and emergency work in New Orleans, you can do it anywhere. I assume you would still hold to that.
I do, yes. The New Orleans is where I got my start doing disaster work, volunteering, and working with various nonprofits in the city following Hurricane Katrina and the levee failure, 20-year anniversary this summer, of course. And so, yes, I stand by that.
Mhm.
If you can figure it out in New Orleans, you can do it anywhere.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm sure you're thinking the same thought I am. So we're going into the hurricane season, and we know we're less than fully prepared. We've made some cuts to some strategic assets that would alert people about the strength of various hurricanes and other things. The claim is we're prepared, that they still have the same access to data, but we've heard different opinions about that. And I think we even heard an official yesterday being somewhat surprised that there was a hurricane season at the federal level. What do you make of that?
Yes, well, that official that you mentioned is the current head of FEMA. So, pretty important that the person leading FEMA understands what hurricane season is and feels prepared going into it, which currently does not apparently seem to be the case. Look, there's always room, looking back at previous hurricane seasons, there's always room for us to be more prepared and to do more. This year, I would say we are not prepared for hurricane season to the best of our ability at all. We are less prepared this year than we have been at any point in the last 19 years for hurricane season. And that is a very scary thing because, as many of us understand, this is a really high risk situation that we're walking into around the country. And the systems and the resources that Americans have come to expect to be there are not necessarily going to be there this year.
So, for somebody who's in this field, and as you said, you're a researcher in this area, and I think we both agreed at the beginning of this, what we like to talk about at Tenacross is not political, but decisions are being made in an administrative way to cut 20% of the FEMA staff, to reduce, if not disband, the National Advisory Council and others who look at the very circumstances that you research. How do you, in your personal work and your professional work, move forward knowing that the ground beneath you is sort of beginning to be undermined?
Yeah, well, I'll be honest, it's very difficult. That said, in emergency management, we operate within a broader political, a broader economic, societal context. And that context changes every time we have a new presidential administration comes in, there are changes to FEMA, right? So in some sense, this is just part of what it means to work in this field, right? Emergency management is all about being prepared for the unexpected, if you will. And so we're definitely putting that to the test right now. At the same time, I will say it is kind of interesting in some ways. The same problems that have existed within the US emergency management system, those problems still exist. They are being amplified or maybe shifted in certain ways, but we've always had a lack of funding, always had a lack of staff, right? Always had back and forths about which risks are most important to plan for. So a lot of those kind of core problems are still true. It's just the environment that we're operating in that has been, I think, pretty radically changed.
So maybe we should step back just a little bit and describe the mission of FEMA as you would have typically understood it in the past, because now some of the disasters or events that it would attend to, it will not be doing, not just because its staff is reduced, but even the criteria by which a disaster would be declared is being adjusted. So what has FEMA been expected to do in the past, and how will that be different in the near future?
Sure. So FEMA was created in 1979, combining a whole bunch of existing kind of emergency management, civil defense type agencies and programs that were operating across the federal government. And so when FEMA was created, the goal of the governors and of Congress and of the Carter administration was to have one agency that was doing what we call comprehensive emergency management, which means working across those four phases of the disaster life cycle. So doing mitigation, trying to prevent disasters from happening, preparing, getting us ready to go through the ones that are going to happen, responding, doing the life-saving measures, and recovery, putting everything back together. And it was really important for them that all four of those phases were located within one agency so that we were taking a holistic approach, right? All of those are interconnected with one another. And so you don't want to split those up. The kind of second thing that FEMA was supposed to do is take an all hazards approach. And what we mean by all hazards is that anything bad that could possibly happen that escalates to the point of needing federal assistance falls within FEMA's purview, but also that as we are preparing and planning for these potential events, we focus in on the commonalities across them, regardless of hazard type, because it's impossible for us to have a unique plan for every single possible hazard scenario that could happen, right? So we want to look across what are the commonalities. We know that we're always going to need to coordinate agencies. We're always going to need to communicate with the public. Sheltering, food, water, medical, these are things that pretty much regardless, whether it's a hurricane or a cyber attack or a volcano, we're going to need to do those things. And so FEMA takes this comprehensive all hazards approach. And since 1979, that has largely remained true. There was a little bit of a hiccup post 9/11 where there was a real emphasis on terrorism above all else. But otherwise, the agency has really stayed pretty true. So FEMA's mission today, word for word, is to help people before, during, and after disasters, which of course is a nod to that comprehensive model.
And since you and I are very familiar with New Orleans and Katrina, and the response by FEMA to Katrina was considered, in many cases, inadequate, although I think there was great intentionality there, a desire to do the right thing. It was an unprecedented disaster, and so you have to give credit to those who were doing their level best to respond to that. But there seems to be that when people are in dire situations or in distress, there may be never enough you can do for them. Their entire lives have been disrupted. Their homes maybe are gone. Who knows, maybe they even have lost members of their family, whatever. So a FEMA agent is in a difficult spot. There are other people who just are generally either distrustful or just think government can't quite meet the moment, and FEMA seems to experience blowback in that regard. So how do you think about the perception of FEMA, given what you just stated was its goal and its ability to carry that out, and the perception of those who are receiving the benefits therein? Why maybe are people feel less than confident in FEMA?
Yeah, I mean, the Public's expectations of FEMA have always been disaligned with what FEMA is meant to do and is allowed to do legally per Congress. When a disaster happens, as individuals, as leaders of our community, we want everyone there to help us. We, as we say, send in the cavalry, right? We want FEMA to come riding in on this white horse. And FEMA does most of the time show up, and they help in various ways, again, as they're allowed to do via authorities granted to the White House, to the president, and from Congress. However, FEMA as an agency was never designed to meet all people's needs before, during, and after disasters, right? We have a model of emergency management in the US where government does some things, but we also rely on people having things like insurance, and we depend on the nonprofit sector and private companies to step in various ways. It's really a quite complex system that involves all of these different stakeholder groups. And unfortunately, the average person does not understand, okay, this thing is the role of the Red Cross versus this is FEMA's role versus this is local government's role. And so when a disaster happens, the kind of there's a misunderstanding of who is supposed to be doing what. And oftentimes FEMA, as the visible federal agency, gets blamed for things. And sometimes, yes, it is their fault. They have messed something up. But more often than not, it's the case that FEMA is kind of the scapegoat for these other failures across stakeholder groups, or failures within Congress or the White House.
I'm going to ask a question as you're describing this situation, which is probably on the minds of anybody listening to this. And then I want to get back to whose responsibility is it, as the current federal administration is suggesting it should be more about the states. But the kind of disasters that FEMA responds to are episodic. So asking a layperson question, where do the people come from who are suddenly available to attend to this event? What were they doing when they weren't handling that flood or that hurricane? How does FEMA actually find the manpower to attend to these events or address these events?
When they created FEMA in 1979, this was a real question and like a problem that needed to be solved. There is not really other federal agencies where at a moment's notice, you all of a sudden need to expand by thousands of employees, right? This is something that is relatively unique to FEMA. And the way the agency over time has handled this is by having their, primary staff that works at FEMA headquarters, that works across the country at their regional offices. Sometimes people there will deploy out to a disaster when one happens. They also have various kind of reservist people who are on standby who can get called in. We did, until about a month ago, have something called FEMA Corps, which is similar to AmeriCorps. So you have kind of an extra subset of volunteers and AmeriCorps people that you can pull in. And then you also have the ability to, or FEMA has the ability to pull other federal workers from other federal agencies. So somebody who's working in another agency within DHS, if we need them, you can, if they're not working on something super, super important, you can pull them off of that, bring them into FEMA, and have them help cover that.
FEMA Corps sounds like such a logical and great idea, like AmeriCorps, to have at the ready people who can step in, who have been trained to manage this, but have other lives and are doing other things. But when this is needed, they're available. It just causes me the concern that so many things have been eliminated. The next time a disaster happens and we need those who might have been in FEMA Corps and they're not there, the criticism will be of FEMA. Where were you? Why weren't there enough of you? And all those things. So we're really creating our own bad luck, or perception is just being built into the way we're doing things. But we mentioned whose responsibility is it? And I think it's great that you laid out the various layers of support and different agencies. What do you think about the pushing of FEMA-like responsibilities to the state level. How are states suddenly going to take this on, in your opinion?
Well, they're not. Look, people in emergency management have said for years, decades, in some cases, that we need to grow the capacity of state and local emergency management. Most people in this country are living under a part-time emergency manager, meaning somebody who is not full-time. It's often the fire chief kind of doubling as the emergency manager. We have volunteer
And
emergency managers. In emergency management, disasters begin and end locally, right? It's that your local government is your first responders, your first level of protection. When they're overwhelmed, then the state comes in. And this is the key. When the state is overwhelmed, then the federal government steps in, right? So this idea that we're going to, as the Trump administration has suggested, eliminate or severely minimize the federal government's involvement is antithetical to what a disaster is, right? Like by definition, you've overwhelmed local and state resources. And so, yes, you can grow the capacity of local and state, which I fully agree with doing, but we have to do that and also, in my opinion, grow the capacity of FEMA and the role of the federal government also, right? Because our risk is increasing across the country. And so there is a real problem that it seems like we're going to walk into here, where the federal government is already pulling back and has said they're going to pull back more, and state and local governments are not ready. They are not currently capable of filling that gap left behind by the federal government, whether it's in response, recovery, mitigation, or preparedness.
that seems so obvious that if you want to make this transition, and you mentioned, or at least strengthen the local circumstances, whereby people actually really do probably know what's happening there in such an intimate way, there's a logic to making sure the resources at the local level are strengthened. But if you were going to do this, you would feather this in, one would think, over time based on a plan to provide that additional capacity at the local level, as opposed to just what appears at the moment, sort of cold turkey. Well, it's different now. And especially
Right.
some of the states who frequently have disasters, so much of their funding comes from the federal government anyway. So they're already dependent on federal resources. How they would add this to what they're expected to cover seems daunting, to say the least.
Yeah, I would add too, the federal government is providing billions and billions of dollars for disaster related costs across the country, right? And that alone is, in many cases, impossible for a state or local government to make up for. I do also want to point out, however, that FEMA also has two other really critical roles in a response and in a recovery. One of them is to coordinate the overall resources of the federal government. We're not just talking here about potentially losing FEMA's resources, but we're also potentially talking about losing the resources of the multiple dozens of other federal agencies that do things related to disasters, whether it's Department of Agriculture, Housing, the EPA, CDC, right? Like all of these other agencies have critical roles and they don't just show up on their own, right? FEMA is coordinating them to be there. So we risk losing the full weight of the federal government. And then the third thing that I think is also really critical for people to understand is that FEMA is the agency that holds the most expertise about disasters, right? They are the ones who go to the most disasters around the country. And so while it is absolutely true that local and state governments have really critical local and state knowledge that is applicable in a disaster, in states where disasters don't happen frequently, they do not at all have the disaster expertise that is needed, right? I'll just speak to Massachusetts, where I live. We don't get major disasters frequently. And as a result, we have not had to do any major rebuilding efforts in Massachusetts. So when you hear the president say, well, we'll just give money to the states and they'll hand it out and do a rebuilding program. Massachusetts does not know how to do a rebuilding program. They've never had to do that before. So in fact, I think it won't shorten the amount of time it takes to go through recovery, right? I think it will actually make it much longer because you don't have that expertise for how to do that thing that you're trying to do.
And there, as you mentioned, there are many things that the federal government can do, and this gets back to the beginning of our conversation. One of the things it can do at scale is gather data in a way that no state possibly could. Having to do, and I'm thinking of NOAA here and a few others that are collecting data that's predictive in nature, and thus sharing that and distributing that. Thus, as you mentioned, other parts of the government are pulled into this effort, some in a very proactive way. So related to FEMA, how are you seeing what appears to be a lessening of our ability to both forecast and really guide resources to the right place, given what we think is about to happen? I'm thinking especially about whether satellites, other Earth observing technologies that only the federal government really could manage.
Yeah, so I mean, the work that we do in emergency management is supposed to be based on our risk, right? And a critical part of knowing what our risk is understanding the various hazards that we face, right? So whether it's, hurricanes, tornadoes, whatever the case may be. And so in emergency management, we are very reliant on the people that I call the hazard scientists. So the meteorologists, the seismologists, and they are also experiencing cuts at their agencies. We are seeing this disruption in data, whether that is a lack of collection or a taking down of previously publicly available data that very much has the potential of affecting the work of emergency managers.
So I just have on that point, and again, we're trying not to cast aspersions at those necessarily making these decisions, but if we're making some cuts purely in the interest of budgetary reasons, that's the rationale. How could we ever want to live with less information? Why would you not want to know? That's the illogic for me of some of the things that surely you are aware of. You want as much information and foresight as you could possibly gain to do the work that you're involved in successfully or optimally.
Yeah, the economic argument doesn't stand up here, right? We have plenty of research that demonstrates that for every dollar FEMA spends on mitigation, we save $6+ on response and recovery, right? And so, in order for us to be able to do effective mitigation, we need to have staff. We need to have mitigation funding, which has currently been cut. We need to have data to make those decisions off of. So an economic argument that these cuts are making emergency management more efficient are, I mean, just don't remotely stand up. And in fact, I would argue FEMA is an efficiency agency by its very design, right? The reason FEMA was created was actually because we wanted emergency management to be more efficient. As I noted earlier, it had previously been spread out across the federal government, and that was a very inefficient way of doing this. And what is being proposed here is another model of emergency management where that authority rests with the state. I would argue that is also an incredibly inefficient model. We are going to, if that is true, that FEMA is going to go away, then that means we're going to have to effectively recreate FEMA in every single state and territory across the country, which to me seems pretty inefficient.
Yeah. And you mentioned programs designed to, again, I think, save money in the long run via preparedness. And I assume the Building Resistance Infrastructure Communities Program, or BRIC, as it was known to many people who were quite excited about what it could do for communities. Can you describe what the intent of that was? Because it's really a proactive move to get to that, let's benefit from that pre-response, which in the long term saves money.
Yeah, so BRIC was a grant program overseen by FEMA. It was actually created during the first Trump administration that had the purpose of providing mitigation and some preparedness funding for state, local governments across the country. A locality could come up with a mitigation project that they wanted to do. Maybe it's do buyouts along the river or some kind of, buying generators for their hospitals, things along those lines. Mm-hmm. And they could put together a proposal, submit that to FEMA, and FEMA would fund those projects, or at least help fund those projects. Again, this is in line with that research that if we put the money in ahead of time, we save money later on, not to mention the lives that you're potentially saving by doing this. And BRIC itself was only created a couple of years ago. And so when the administration announced that they were taking back the funding that had been allocated from BRIC, they said it was part of the reason was because the program hadn't been successful, right? Well, mitigation is something that takes a long time, potentially years, for us to really see the benefit of. It takes a long time to build a levee. It's not a short-term project, right? And then it takes even longer for that potential disaster to maybe happen, and then it to be prevented by the mitigative efforts that you've done, right? So for these kinds of programs to be successful, you're really playing the long game. You don't necessarily see that payout right away. We see it later on down the road.
Yeah, this is the dichotomy with regard to resources. When the bad action doesn't happen, people are wondering, well, then what did we spend the money on? I get that perceptual challenge. So how does insurance figure into this? It is a big topic in the Tenacross region in California, obviously with the fires, in Louisiana and Florida and other Gulf states, typically around hurricanes. People are unable to get insurance because the risk is obviously there. The costs are going up. Sometimes you're seeing private actors moving out, and thus people having to go to the insurance of last resort, which is typically state issued, which has all the issues that we've already brought up about states being able to manage things at a certain scale. How do your thoughts about insurance figure into this discussion?
Yeah, I mean, insurance has always been a really critical piece of whether or not people will be able to recover. And I think that is becoming even more true as we see instability and uncertainty coming from government in terms of what recovery resources may or may not be available to individuals. Unfortunately, the timing of that is not great because, as you said, we have many communities that I would argue are already in an insurance crisis, others that are well on their way. And it's tough. I think some people have argued for a long time that insurance is kind of the answer to climate adaptation, that we're just going to kind of insure our way and distribute the risk as a way of kind of getting out of having to pay the true costs of climate change, let alone other hazards. And I struggle with that. I don't really see that happening in reality. I think, my opinion on this is that we are at a point where you really do need Congress to intervene on the insurance issue. And that is not a politically popular thing. I think many in the insurance industry probably don't want that.
What would that look when you say intervene? In what way? Because we're very interested in insurance at Tenacross, and we're seeing all kinds of propositions, innovations. When you think the federal government should intervene, what are you implying by that?
I mean, I think there's like a couple options, right? Obviously, we already have federally backed flood insurance. There is an idea that perhaps we have an all hazards federally backed insurance program that, again, can be politically controversial. I think, but we're seeing potentially the need really arise, particularly with wildfires now, in addition to flooding. I think there's also room here for greater federal oversight over states that are taking the approach of Florida, for example, of coming up with alternative insurance models. I think the key here, as is often the case when it comes to disaster recovery, is having layers of protection and oversight. There is, an endless list of lawsuits, an endless list of people who are not getting from their insurance companies what they think they are supposed to be getting. And so building in those protections for the consumers, for survivors, is really critical. And if states aren't going to step up and do that, then I think that is a place where the federal government has a responsibility to step in.
Mm-hmm. So you teach young people and offer courses around the topics that we're discussing. What's their perception? One, why to get into this business? I'm sure that you are an extremely compelling teacher and clearly know your facts around these topics. But are young people saying, wow, this looks like a growth industry as climate change is approaching and I want to get into it? Or do they have a certain, let's call it just a degree of despair that we're having to spend this much time on this topic and now seeing maybe at the federal level less attention to it than it deserves? How do people view this who are 18, 19, 20 years old that you work with?
Yeah, it's kind of up in the air right now. So if you asked me prior to January, I would say most of my students are people who are interested in climate change, worried about the effects of climate change. They are people who want to help other people, help their communities, and see emergency management as being a way to do that. Some of them are wanting to go into fire or some other kind of more hazard specific areas. And so this is a good degree for them to have. That's still true, but I will say this has been a really rough semester. I'm teaching freshmen this semester. My course that I'm teaching happens to be emergency management policy. And we've been reading news articles in class every single day, keeping up with the changes that are happening. And it is hard to sit there and tell them about, these great careers that they can have in emergency management when I'm not totally sure that those are going to continue to exist. At the same time, I have not lost any students from our program. They're definitely hanging in there. And as I said earlier, right, this is emergency management. You got to learn how to pivot. And so that's what some of them are kind of thinking about, figuring out how to do that. We do have seniors who are graduating who have lost jobs that had been promised to them, have lost internships that were promised to them. We had several that were wanting to go into the humanitarian sector, USAID, and obviously that is no longer an option, at least for the meantime. So it's tough. It's hard. But I think that the way through that is by being really upfront with what's happening, help them to understand the policy changes, what this means for the future. And I will say I have been unbelievably impressed with their ability to rise to the occasion and really dig into the policy and try to kind of understand the politics of this moment, which even I have a hard time understanding sometimes.
Causing them, as you say, potentially to pivot from what they thought they were going to do that might be more intimately related to emergency management to getting into politics, or figuring out a way to address that problem and telling you, hey, I think I'm going to do this instead?
I have had a couple students say to me, I hate politics now. I never want to talk about any of this again. And then I've had some who have said, maybe I'll get into politics. So mixed bag there.
Yeah. Got it. Well, I've seen some extraordinary young people who were planning on doing great things on behalf of this country, who, like you mentioned about others, had internships and or jobs waiting for them at the State Department or other agencies, which clearly have an incredible role in promoting the interests of the citizenry of the country, and now don't have those opportunities. And I worry about that generation, or a fraction of a generation, and their enthusiasm for the greater good being lost. And I'm sure you're witnessing the same thing, and we want to do everything we can to prevent that, of course. So Samantha, a closing thought from you, again, going back to the very essence of this conversation. You are about responding to what our communities need in a time of need, and the tide is sort of moving out at the moment. As you see your personal future and how you're going to adjust to this, and how maybe you'll teach differently, what does the immediate future look like for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think everyone in emergency management right now is kind of holding our breath a bit until the next big disaster. We've had several smaller disasters across the country since January, but we haven't had a major disaster. And I think when that disaster happens, where it happens, what it is, who it happens to, that is going to have a pretty significant influence over what the future of emergency management looks like. And incidentally, when you look at the history of how emergency management has evolved, it has been from these, big focusing events, as we call them, that really shift the policy, shift the politics. So I think we're kind of in a bit of a holding pattern, waiting for that next big disaster, unfortunately. When we get there, I think the single most important thing for those of us who want to create a more effective emergency management system for the future is making sure that we have a clear narrative for the public about what has happened, why failures have happened, and what needs to change so that it doesn't happen again. And obviously, we are dealing with a really complicated media ecosystem right now. We saw the unbelievable amount of disinformation during Hurricane Helene last fall. And I think things have probably gotten worse since then. So we really have an uphill battle, not to mention, thinking ahead a couple steps, thinking about what do we need to do policy wise to put things back together or to make other, changes to the system.
Well, you're not the first person I've heard say the correction to what we're witnessing right now, unfortunately, is a major disaster, which will get the attention of everyone. We'll observe some things to say, this isn't right. We can't go on like this. We have to be more, again, proactive or more at the ready when these things happen. So it's a very unusual time and situation to be in, to say the least. But Samantha, I want to say thank you so much for your insights. You're an incredible spokesperson for a difficult topic, and very rational about what needs to be done and how to do it. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.